Hello, my name's Olurotimi. Today, I want to continue my discussion on uh, Odysseus and the Greek classics, and I'm emphasizing on the similarities between um, the Greeks' Odysseus, right, and the biblical King David. I've done an earlier video in which I pointed one similarity that both men feigned madness, right? Odysseus feigned madness when he was trying to get out of um, being recruited for the Trojan War, right? When King Agamemnon and Palamedes came to recruit him in Ithaca, and he pretended to be crazy. And David also feigned madness in the Bible when he was in the lair of the Philistines, his uh, adversaries, and he was in the court of the king of Gath, and so he pretended he was crazy, of course, to escape death. And uh, Odysseus did the same thing, pretended to be crazy in order to avoid being recruited uh, for the Trojan War. Uh, that's a different video. I went into an extensive discussion, gave the backstory. Today, that I want to emphasize some other similarities that are very striking. It's uncanny that they have all these similarities. This is something I noticed because when I'm a student of the Bible and I've read the Odyssey and the Iliad, and I've encountered Odysseus, stories of Odysseus in amongst other Greek historians, right, and poets. It's interesting that other scholars, historians have actually written on these striking similarities. But I'm just going to try and get into it and try and keep this video short. I'm not going to. It's not an exhaustive. It's not an exhaustive discussion regarding the similarities, and so I would probably do one or two other videos just pointing out with more emphasis some other uh, similarities between David and um, and Odysseus. So importantly, starting off, obviously they're both kings, right? They're both kings, and they're kings of uh, unknown nations, right? David, of course, he became king. He was the second king of Israel. And so Israel was not yet large. It was not yet at its, it was still growing, when he became king. And so he was actually responsible for growing the size of Israel. So he was a man of war. So they're also both great warriors. And Odysseus, of course, was king of Ithaca. Ithaca wasn't a large country like Mycenae or Sparta. It was rather small. It wasn't rich, But the thing is, Odysseus was known. He was invaluable to the Greek kings because he was known to be very intelligent, right? Very intelligent, and David as well was very intelligent. Of course, his son is supposed to be the wisest king in the Bible, but that's because the father did all the work, did all the fighting. So they were both great warriors. Now, apart from that as well, obviously they had wanderings, right? They're both known for having wandered away from their kingdom for long periods. Odysseus, that's main the main emphasis of the drama, the tragedy, or whatever it is, the Odyssey by Homer. Um, Odysseus is wandering, right? He's wandering around the seas, and he's because he's basically trying to escape one danger after the other because he's cursed, right? So he's like a fugitive kind of. It was after the Trojan War, and he was just trying to return home, but of course he gets cursed by Poseidon, and he finds that he's constantly docking one crisis after the other, and then until he becomes eventually ensnared, held captive by Calypso, a goddess, on her island for 7 years, and eventually, of course, he's let go, and he's able to go back home. David, of course, became a fugitive because his king, he was captain to the king of Saul, sorry, King Saul of Israel, who was the king of Israel, and who wanted him dead. And so David became a fugitive, or constantly ducking the wrath of Saul, constantly in hiding. So he was a fugitive for a long time as well. And he had to, he was leading a band of fugitives as well, a band of misfits, undesirables. Those were the first people that David actually led when he wasn't, when he was a fugitive. So you see these wanderings, both of them were wandering, and had these difficult period. Um, and when we consider who uh, their adversaries were, they had similar opponents, right? They had similar adversaries. King David, it's funny. Their alter ego, right, was was someone who cut uh, a striking figure, right? So King David's alter ego, he's not, sorry, not his alter ego. He's like his nemesis, right? Rather, his nemesis, um, the opponent, right? Uh, cut a striking figure. In the case of David, right? He was his adversary was King Saul, right? Um, if we look at the description of Saul, Saul was when he's described by Samuel in the the book of Samuel, um, when Samuel is anointing Saul, they say Saul is the tallest man in Israel. He stood like he was at least a head above everybody else in Israel. So he was a very tall, imposing figure. The same thing with Odysseus's adversary, Ajax. I've discussed Ajax. Ajax. So there's somebody else writes about that, Sophocles. Sophocles wrote about the rivalry of Odysseus and Ajax for the armor of Achilles, right? In his tragedy, Ajax. And so Ajax is described as someone who was large, was very, he was very big, very strong, and he relied on brute force, on his strength, and so he was a very impressive, large figure as well, just like uh, King Saul, compared to David. So you see, David was sort of an average, ordinary looking guy compared to King Saul. The same thing as Odysseus. Odysseus was just like an average, ordinary looking guy compared to Ajax, right? His rival. And another thing, both of their rivals, right, would die by suicide. Um, both of their rivals would die by suicide, and not just die by suicide. Both um, protagonists. I'm calling them protagonists here. That's for the Bible. David is the protagonist that I'm discussing, and for the Greeks, uh, Odysseus is the protagonist I'm discussing. Both of them would give honorable burials, right, to their. They'll argue for, they would advocate honorable and prestigious burials for their rivals, right? Heroes' burials. I did a video discussing the rivalry between Odysseus and Ajax. And Ajax, of course, wanted Odysseus dead, but the Greek goddess Athena intervened, right, and drove Ajax mad. And Ajax, of course, delusionally slaughtered animals, thinking he was killing Odysseus and Agamemnon and Menelaus, right, his enemies. But it was Odysseus that he really hated. It was Odysseus because he was angry that Odysseus won the armor of Achilles, which he wanted. By the way, Ajax was Achilles' cousin, right? So he that was by his half cousin or whatever, by uh, King Peleus. That's through Achilles' father, right? Achilles had a human father and he had a goddess for a mother. That's Thetis. And King Peleus was the uncle of Ajax. So Ajax, of course, was shamed and he committed suicide by falling on his sword, right? He fell on his sword. And interestingly, after he died, Odysseus argued with Agamemnon that Ajax deserved a hero's burial, right? He advocated for this, even though he knew that Ajax had tried to kill him, right? The reason for Ajax's downfall was because he failed in his attempt to murder Odysseus. But after his death, after Ajax's suicide, in which he fell on his sword, Odysseus argued that he persuaded Agamemnon that Ajax should receive a hero's burial, which he did. And similarly, Saul, who wanted David dead as well, when he was defeated in Bible in the sorry when he was defeated in battle, Saul committed suicide by falling on his sword, right? And after that, though, the Philistines got hold of his body and decapitated him and hung his body, right? Hung his body in public just to, they desecrated his body. Later on, of course, there were these valiant men of Jabesh, Gilead, who went, fought and retrieved his body, gave him a burial. But later on, David himself, he heard of this and he praised the valiant man for doing that, for honoring the body of Saul. And he himself gave Saul a prestigious and honorable burial, right, in Israel. So you could see, even though Saul had been trying to kill him and he became a fugitive, but Saul had failed, to kill him. So you can see that, and it's kind of interesting, the parallel that uh, both these men, right, they looked alike. That's Ajax and Saul, right? They were similar, very tall, impressive, an imposing figure, both men. And they failed in the attempt to kill the protagonist, the respective protagonist, and then they died, committed suicide by falling on their sword. But yet, the respective protagonist gave them honorable burials, right? So that's kind of interesting. Um, the other thing is, in their character, these both of these men had, um, they used a lot of cunning intelligence, right? Cunning intelligence, and you I think I'll do that. I'll save this for another video. That's the moral flexibility both men exercised, right? They were not so. Again, this is an academic exercise, not with respect uh, to my faith as a Christian, right? I'm doing this analysis based on a study of the classics and like an exegesis of the Bible. So these two men had cunning intelligence, and they exercised moral flexibility. So they were not averse to uh, changing, bending the rules to satisfy their self-interest, right? So they used lies, they used cunning to achieve their goals, right? Um, uh, so they were flawed men. Let me put it that way. With regard to the moral flexibility thing, because that's a complex thing, I'd have to define what moral flexibility is first, and then I'll do another video so that I could just be more specific on the moral flexibility thing. But they would use, there are times that they used deception, lies to advance their goals. Um, I recall in this situation of David, right? When David, first of all, okay, they were away from, they were away from their home, so they had to fight. Both men had to fight to regain their kingdoms, right? when Odysseus was returning home, of course, the suitors had infiltrated his home and eating him out of house and home. They were trying to secure the hand of his wife Penelope because they thought he was dead, and so they were trying to marry her. So he had to come and fight his way back to regain his kingdom. Of course, David, apart from being a fugitive when he was not yet king, right? He was on the run because he was anointed to become king, and he was a fugitive, escaping the wrath of King Saul, the incumbent king at the time. But eventually, when he did become king, there was a time that he was overthrown. Right, he was overthrown by his own son, and so he was fighting to. He was fleeing from his son, and he had to fight to gain back his kingdom. Now, there was a time, and one of the things that he did, for instance, he used this cunning, right? He used lies, disinformation. So both men used disinformation. Specifically, I like this. There are many instances where they used disinformation, but I want to focus on this particular instance when David, knowing his chief counselor had betrayed him and gone on the side of his son, right, Absalom. And Ahithophel, that was his chief counselor. And David prayed that, okay, God turned the counsel of Ahithophel to foolishness, right? He did pray that, but he did execute the strategy to to use disinformation in the court of his son Absalom, right? So he sent a uh, like an like a mole, so to speak, right, amongst the counselors of his son Absalom. So that was another counselor he had, but what that was loyal to David, but his son didn't know that. Nobody knew he was secretly loyal to David. That's his name was Hushai. Hushai. So everything Ahithophel in the Bible, it says that his counsel was like, he was like an oracle from God, right? So he was the wisest counselor of David, but he was a turncoat, right? So he was giving Absalom certain counsel, and David knew that if Absalom uh, acceded and to the counsel, the guidance of Ahithophel, he would defeat David. So David sent Hushai to deceive Absalom, and Absalom foolishly listened to Hushai. Hushai would contradict everything Ahithophel said, and Absalom foolishly listened to Ahithophel, right? And eventually, David was able to defeat his son, and of course, Ahithophel committed suicide. But in the case of um, uh, Odysseus, of course, lied constantly, used deception constantly. But the time that he used disinformation, that's very interesting, that everybody likes, was when he lied to the Cyclops, Polyphemus, who was the son of Poseidon, right? He told him when they were trapped in his cave, and uh, Polyphemus asked for the name of David, right? David was using cunning, right? He was plying him with alcohol so he would be drunk. And so you see their craftiness in the strategy. So reason that Odysseus, by the way, plied this guy, because they were stuck in the cave of Polyphemus, right? And he had this huge rock that he used to block the cave, the entrance, so they couldn't get out, and they couldn't push that huge rock. So they got him drunk, and even though they got him drunk, and they didn't kill him when he slept off, they decided to blind him in his eye so that he'll be able to move the rock out of the way and they'll be able to leave. Otherwise, they'll be stuck in the cave. But and Odysseus had planned ahead. So uh, uh, when the Cyclops asked Odysseus for his name, Odysseus lied and said nobody. So he had sort of anticipated what was going to happen. So when he gave his name as nobody, and they blinded him with a stake in his eye, so the Cyclops was one eye. And so, well, he had one eye, and he was now blind because they struck him in the stabbed him in the eye with the stake, and he was screaming. His brothers, the other Cyclops are outside, right, when they were trying to help him, and they were outside. They were asking him, "What's going on? Who's hurting you? Who's hurting you?" He starts going shouting, "Nobody's hurting me. Nobody is hurting me," because that was the name Odysseus had given him. So you see the disinformation that Odysseus used to divert to avert disaster. So they thought, okay, well, he was fine. He was just drunk and just screaming or whatever, just making an unnecessary ruckus. And so they left. They left him, and this was how he was able to escape. That's Odysseus. They were able to escape. So you see how he uses disinformation. Now, another thing is the character of their adversary, right? The way they both fought, conquered these giants, right? These giants, and the giants. So Odysseus conquers a giant, that's Cyclops, Polyphemus, right? And he was one-eyed, right? And he struck him in there, right? So he overcame, he subdued a giant. David, of course, we all know, also subdued a giant, Goliath, right? Was the champion uh, of the Philistines, and the way he subdued him, right? He used a catapult, right? Uh, a slingshot, and struck him. It's interesting where he struck him. He struck him in the center of his forehead, right? So you see that center of the forehead is very interesting, because that's the same way. That's the same place where Odysseus struck the giant Cyclops, Polyphemus, in the center. His one eye was in the center of his forehead, right? So the same spot. So it's kind of interesting, and also uh, how these two, there's also the instrumentality of women, right? How women were significant in helping them escape danger, right? We know how Odysseus. We're going to see that in the upcoming movie by Christopher Nolan, The Odyssey. Odysseus he was sort of held captive on the island of uh, the witch Circe, right? But he willingly became Circe's lover. But when he wanted to go home, he wanted to return home, Circe was the one who gave him guidance on how he could have a safer journey, right? How he could escape dangers. He should go into the underworld and meet with Tiresias, the blind prophet in the underworld, and he gave him guidance on what to do. And she told him about how to avoid the other dangers, Scylla and Charybdis, right, on the seas. I've done a video explaining those dangers, and so I'm not going to go into detail. So women, were significant instruments, and there was Nausicaa, the princess Nausicaa, in the land of the Phaeacians, right? When he landed naked on the land of the Phaeacians, and she favored him and took him to the king, and eventually they helped him get back home. So several women. There was also so there are these encounters that David also had with women. So when David was fleeing from the King Saul, the first person who helped him was his wife, because he was married to the king's daughter. And the king's daughter told him that, okay, the king was sending people to kill him, and she had him escape through the window, and she put a dummy, right, a dummy in the bed. So they went to attack the dummy instead. Also, there was the time his encounter with Abigail. So David was attacked. David had wanted to go and kill a man that had not been hospitable to him. Nabal was a wealthy man, and David expected him to show him some hospitality for having protected Nabal's sheep, his flock, right? But Nabal scorned him, right? And, saying, hey, who the heck is David? I don't know him. And so David wanted to go and kill him, and that could have destroyed his destiny. But Nabal's wife, who was Abigail, went and supported David, gave him provisions, and said, hey, don't do this, because God is on your side. So she showed loyalty to David, and Nabal eventually died, and when he was struck dead, David married her. So you see the loyalty, the instrumentality of women, the agency of women in their path, right, in their careers, right. So in both cases, with Odysseus, right, in the Odyssey, and of course um, in to David in the Bible. In fact, also I forgot to mention Penelope, right? The queen, Penelope, she stayed faithful. She didn't marry herself off to any of those suitors. There were over 100 suitors. It was I think about 108 who were trying to marry her and become king, take over his kingdom. But she remained faithful, and she was deceiving. She was deceiving the suitors by pretending to be weaving a shroud for her father-in-law, and each night she'd unravel it. She'd say, okay, she's going to make a decision after she finishes the shroud. So she remained faithful and loyal. And so you see, both men had the agency of women who were very loyal to them, right? The support of women who proved to be very loyal to them. So that's kind of interesting. I'm going to stop this video here, and I'm going to continue because there's so many striking similarities between these two figures. Again, Odysseus is not, I was going to say historic. So David is a historical figure, right, in the Bible. Um, by the way, so David lived, it's interesting. I've pointed out how both of them died around the age of 70. So David lived around 1060 BC, um, 1040 BC to 970 BC approximately, right? So he died around the age of 70. Odysseus similarly around 70. Odysseus is estimated to have lived between 1230 BC and um, 1160, 1230 BC and 1160 BC, right? So again, when you're doing BC, the age is increasing as the years descend, counting backwards. So both of them lived to be approximately 70 years old, you know, and I'll stop it here because there are lots of striking similarities, and I'll do some more similarities between um, the Greek Odysseus. By the way, again, Odysseus, that was what I was going to say. Odysseus, he's not an invention of Homer, because Homer did write of him in the Iliad and then in the Odyssey, where he's the central figure, right? But there are other Greeks as well, Greeks poets who wrote about him. Sophocles, like I mentioned, wrote about him in Ajax. Um, um, Euripides wrote about him, right, in Palamedes. So there's so many other so in fact Plato spoke of him as well. So the Greeks valorize him as a historical figure, a hero, but I think he's mainly he's mythological. He's in the classification of Greek myths, right? But legendary myths, just like Achilles, but in any event, I will stop this video here, and I'll continue in a subsequent one, comparing, the figures of Odysseus and uh, biblical King David. My name is Oluro Timiosha, and I will keep you posted. Thank you.